Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm Connor, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. It is Saturday, March 27th, 2021. Today we will be discussing the controversy surrounding the border and what is not being brought up surrounding it, the role of newspapers in shootings, the rising tide of voter suppression in Georgia, and lawsuits being brought against Fox News. Without further delay, let's jump into it. During the 2020 election, the issue of border crossing and border security was a key issue that caused immense tension among the American people. One of the most controversial things about the previous administration's immigration policy was its separation of children at the border. Indeed, it was the symbol of all that was wrong with Trumpist rhetoric and a sign of the cruelty of the administration. Now, however, the Biden administration is faced with the challenges of making a broken immigration system work without being consumed by the toxic legacy of his predecessor. All the while, critics on both the left and the right are seizing on the Biden administration's seemingly unprepared response to the rise in border crossings. Right-wingers are already jumping on the Biden administration to argue that Trump's policies were justified and that President Biden's loosening of some of those restrictions has brought about a surge of illegal immigrants that has made America less safe. They have created this crisis of children coming in, said GOP Representative Michael McCall of Texas, arguing his point on ABC on Sunday. Continuing his argument, Representative McCall stated that, quote, "The traffickers are smart. Cartels are smart. They know our laws, policies, and this started right after the election. In the last 2 months, we've seen a real surge," end quote. Of course, there's more to the story than right-wing critics have let on. For one, the surge we are seeing is smaller than what we saw in 2019, 2016, and 2014. In fact, these surges are common and come every 2 to 3 years, and each time the administration in charge tries to duck for cover from the political backlash that comes with it. Regardless of which party is in power, the migration patterns that have continued for years are not being dealt with in a humane or adequate fashion. And despite what Trumpists would like to believe, it is not a matter of enforcement. Both former presidents Obama and Trump saw increases in migrant children arriving at the U.S. border, many times without their parents. Not to mention the fact that the current surge began in April of last year, prior to Biden being sworn into office. What's happening is that the U.S. has fundamentally failed to build a large-scale plan for dealing with asylum seekers and refugees. There are nowhere near the amount of immigration judges necessary to judge asylum requests on a case-by-case basis, and Americans have been demanding change on that front for at least a year now, as 86% of Americans said that was very important, according to a 2019 poll conducted by Pew Research Center. Left-wing critics of the Biden administration have also popped up, noting that Biden has opened another facility in Texas that holds migrants in what amount to detention facilities, similar to the tent cities that Trump and his administration had used during his controversial term. Under current law, children are to be turned over to Health and Human Services within 3 days. However, that is not happening for many of these children, much like it didn't under Trump. Some children have been said to have been kept up to 10 days, a clear violation of statutory law. What's being missed here is that the American immigration policy of the past and present has been entirely inadequate, with or without immigration hawks in power. This is partially because immigration hawks seem far too inclined to sabotage their political opponents' chances at pursuing an alternative route on immigration. As NPR's Joel Rose noted, the Trump administration significantly reduced the size of the HHS shelter system, ensuring that attempts to house migrants during surges would be hampered. In November, December, and January, the Trump administration failed to adequately provide information to the incoming Biden presidency about the state of America's immigration infrastructure, further amplifying an already difficult scenario. To be clear, this isn't entirely the Trump administration's fault. It's been a long-term problem for multiple administrations, as I noted earlier. But Trump's response to the problems of migrants coming in did not make it easier to deal with this issue from presidency to presidency. Therefore, the Biden administration was faced with two choices: let many of these young migrants in or reject them out of hand, which would ignore that many of these people are minors. Currently, we still do expel single adults who come over without permission. That has not changed. We currently don't have enough shelters, however, or judges to process these migrants. But 80% of the children detained at the border have some relatives in the United States, many of whom are parents. This means that they can be given shelter with family members here, and that means we should prioritize that. Of course, that'll take time, but getting them to family members must be a top priority if we're going to have a strong infrastructure in the future. We can't throw them into a system that is inadequate and unprepared. In the meantime, there needs to be a genuine shift in our immigration policy. We need to begin expanding the number of judges that handle asylum cases that we have, create a pathway to citizenship for asylum seekers, and create systems that will ensure a greater amount of transparency to ensure that we don't have another kids in cages scenario with our shelters. But then again, that comes from a genuine desire to see reform across the political spectrum. The hawkishness on immigration will not work, and it will not help any of these children. Now is not the time for chest beating. Now is the time for building immigration infrastructure that can last. Last week I talked about the shootings in Atlanta and how racism is likely connected to the shooter's actions, but there was another shooting in Boulder, Colorado within the same week not long after that coverage. The shooting took place at King Soopers store in which 10 people were tragically killed. The police are still looking for a motive. Police say that the shooter, who again I will not be naming, was armed with a semi-automatic rifle and a pistol, the AR-556, a smaller version of the Armalite 15. The suspect was described as ill, prone to violence, and had a misdemeanor assault charge against him. And these shootings are a painful, constant reminder in America about the inadequate ways in which we handle this violence. But more than that, I think we need to stop for a moment and take a look at how the media covers this. In the brief moment I talked to you about this, I was using a multitude of sources. All of them, in their coverage that I read, used the shooter's face and name. And there's a problem with that. It can create copycats, and it can give the shooter undue attention to their personhood rather than the horrid crime they committed and the means by which they committed that crime. Yes, the news should report on the shooters and their motives, habits, and everything else, but you don't have to place their face and name front and center at the issue. If you go back to my previous podcast, you will see that I don't name the shooter in Atlanta, not once. That was intentional. I could just as easily explain what contributed to the shooter's behavior without giving him the attention he craved. In response to criticism like this, journalists have understandably argued that the naming of these shooters can help identify trends. But a name is not the same as a history of mental health problems or a history of violence. Those are useful in identifying trends, not names. None of this helps to memorialize the victims who inevitably go forgotten by the press, and it almost always guarantees a sort of lurid curiosity by the public about the shooter. There are exceptions, of course. If a shooter is still on the run, then it is a necessity to release the name and pictures of the said shooter. But unless that happens, the name is not necessary. It also doesn't help when the name sounds foreign when the person has lived here all their lives. After the release of the Boulder shooter's name, numerous right-wing commentators, including Ben Shapiro and others, began using the shooter's name as a means to claim that Islam was the problem, even though police have not established a motive and the circumstances surrounding the shooting were far more random than that of the Atlanta shooting. So again, the name in this case is being used by right-wingers to paint this tragedy as a case of radical Islamists shooting everyday Americans. And then, after that was all said and done, the shooter's name was trending on Twitter for several hours, meaning that thousands upon thousands of people were spreading this person's name all because it was a Muslim-sounding name. And what gets lost in the lurid Muslim name fiasco is that this person had a history of violent behavior. His classmates were alarmed by him. He had problems with paranoia, and family members said that he thought people were watching him and following him all the time. All of that got lost in the discussion. To be clear, we should not just be blaming mental illness out of hand. Most mentally ill people are not violent. But what got lost here is that a person with a history of violent behavior got access to a gun that he had no business having in the first place. Whatever your opinion of gun control, I think it is fair to say that it is completely unacceptable that this personal nonsense is being used as a distraction from the horror of these shootings and what caused them. If anyone deserves to be named, it's the victims, not the shooter. And the media needs to start doing better on that. On another note, we have to turn to Georgia, where Senators Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff were recently elected, breaking Mitch McConnell's hold on the Senate. However, the level of organization that helped benefit the Democrats, particularly in the black community, has alarmed Republicans who have long held on to the state as a bastion. Indeed, 88% of black voters in Georgia voted for Biden and 90% voted for Senators Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. Trump infamously attempted to sway the votes in Georgia, alleging without evidence that there was a widespread voter fraud campaign in the state, which Republicans are now using to justify their increased restrictions. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, who is notorious among voter advocates for purging voter rolls in his 2018 race against Stacey Abrams, signed a bill that restricts mail-in voting, early day voting, and other forms of voting that traditionally helps black voters. Indeed, this is specifically targeted against black people. It also criminalizes any non-staff member who provides food or water to those waiting in line to vote. Governor Kemp argues that this is part of a larger effort to prevent cheating, but so far, his office has not provided any evidence that such cheating was prevalent in the previous election. Already, 3 civil rights organizations have sued the state over the new law, arguing that it will restrict black voters in particular. Some may object to the assertion that it will harm black voters more, and I understand that knee-jerk reaction. On its face, it appears to be a security measure, but once you understand that black voters in Georgia are largely proliferated around Atlanta and the surrounding areas, it becomes clear why this bill is such a problem. Black voters in Georgia, like in many other areas of the country, generally live in higher population areas where voting lines are long, as they have been since at least 2018. So while it will harm non-black voters and white voters too, black voters are the targeted audience. Already, protests have broken out against the act that the governor signed. State Representative Park Cannon was arrested outside the governor's office as she tried knocking on the door to get access to him when he was attempting to sign the bill away from the public eye. She was charged with felony obstruction only after officers refused to tell her what she was being charged with when faced with cameras. They then dragged her from the State House, despite the State House being in session. I don't want to sound alarmist, but if another country did something like this, we would probably be sanctioning them. It's a losing party that's making up conspiracy theories about voter fraud to explain away how it lost the election, and when they receive backlash, they arrest their critics. Imagine if this was any other country on earth. Would you say that that country is free? I don't think so. And make no mistake, the state of Georgia is going to keep pushing voters out as much as they can to keep Republicans in power, but no party is entitled to power. Making it harder for people to vote because of spurious allegations of fraud is an authoritarian act steeped in racism. It needs to end. This is one of the reasons the People's Act must be approved, even if it means killing the filibuster. The states are not going to protect people's rights, so the federal government must do so for them. Turning to a different subject, Dominion Voting Systems, a voting technology company, has filed suit against Fox News for defamation on Friday, which makes it the second lawsuit to come out of the network's coverage of the supposed voter fraud conspiracy in the 2020 election. Before the Dominion suit, Smartmatic, another voting technology company, had sued Fox News for their coverage of its role in the 2020 election as well. Though Fox had previously attempted to dismiss lawsuits against them, the growing body of legal action taken against the network suggests that its motion to dismiss have an uphill battle to fight, though that does not mean Dominion or Smartmatic are guaranteed any victory. Despite there being very little evidence to suggest that there was massive voter fraud in the 2020 election, several personalities alleged there was on Fox airtime. Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell were some of the most prevalent among them. However, they were far from alone. Maria Bartiromo, Lou Dobbs, and Janine Pirro also contributed to said conspiracy theories. Attorneys for Dominion have noted that their employees are also the victims of harassment and, in some extreme cases, death threats resulting from the conspiracies that they allege have been carried out by Fox News personalities. Dominion is demanding over $1 billion in damages. Other right-wing media outlets have had to take back some of their claims to avoid a lawsuit, including OAN, which cut off Mike Lindell, the CEO of MyPillow, over his continued promotion of those conspiracy theories. It should not surprise anyone where I stand on this issue. Fox and other networks consistently promoted lies about the 2020 election when they could gin up ratings from it, and now they want to hide from their contribution to this wave of conspiracism. It's engulfed the nation, and they're the ones who helped spread it. For a long time, right-wing media has maintained a sort of laissez-faire attitude to what is said on air and what is said online. But what has gone ignored for so long is that there is an inherent responsibility for the rhetoric that comes out of your mouth. By that I mean that people and publishers are responsible for what they say. In this case, Fox is responsible for promoting a conspiracy theory via its guest and its talent on air. And if they lie or spread nonsense that poisons the body politic, then they can and ought to be held liable for that. Not just as a matter of protecting the businesses that they lie about, but as a means to keep their bad faith rhetoric out of the political sphere. Defamation is a difficult thing to prove, but if we are to turn the tide against conspiracy theories, then it has to start somewhere. And civil court seems like a good place to start. Thank you all for joining me today. This was a bit more of a soapbox episode than I anticipated, but I think it is merited given everything that is coming up. Be sure to check out the Progressive American Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter account, where I will be posting new information about where this podcast and the general publication is going. You can find me on Twitter as well by looking up my name in the podcast description, or the author location. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next week.